You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by the National Association of Convenience Stores.
And welcome to Convenience Matters, where we talk about things that matter to convenience stores. And that means they matter to consumers, because you get about 160 million consumers at convenience stores every day in the U.S. and many tens and hundreds of millions more around the world. My name is Jeff Leonard. I'm with the National Association of Convenience Stores.
And I'm John Eichberg with the Fuels Institute and NACS. And you're right, Jeff, we talk about things that power you, power the consumer, power the body, power the car, fuel you as you go forward. And there's no better place to fuel your lifestyle than in a convenience store every single day. You know what, Jeff, we really are living in a global market. If you think about it, autos, fuels, they're all global architectures. They're traded across borders. NACS spends a lot of time looking overseas. And I spent some time down in South America taking a look at the fuels market. And it's amazing how many similarities and differences we find down in those markets.
Yeah, and if you look, there's 154,000 convenience stores in the United States, and we've done some guessing and some estimating in how many are worldwide. We're trying to pin down that number. It's over 1 million. And if you think about that, it's 1.1, 1.2 million is the best guess we have right now, number of convenience stores in the world. Nothing else matches that. And there aren't 1.1 million different ideas out there, but there's some real interesting ideas when you go from country to country, how they're serving customers and how they're often jumping across borders, because you look at, even in the U.S., OXXO is the Mexican-based chain. They have 14,000 stores. They're adding 1,000 stores a year. Last year, they added 2 in Texas. So they're now in the U.S. market. Couche-Tard, Canadian company, is now the largest company in the U.S. and Canada in combined store count. Close behind, 7-Eleven, which is, of course, owned by a Japanese company. And so the transmix, if you will, to use a gasoline phrase, nice, is very much at play in terms of looking at global ideas and looking at what's going on in South America, I think is something that we will probably see some of those things within our stores the next few years here in the U.S.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things we can learn. So I spent most of my time evaluating the market down in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And first of all, Buenos Aires, love the city. Beautiful, beautiful architecture. It's an interesting mix between classic, like French turn of the century, 19th, 20th century architecture, but right across the street is like a miniature Times Square. It is a really, really cool town. But from a market standpoint, there's very stark differences. One is they're 100% full serve. The United States is all self-serve. And that is a huge difference. They operate really 4 different fuel types. They have a high sulfur diesel and a low sulfur diesel to accommodate European designed engines, which is a 10 parts per million sulfur. They have a 98 RON, which is about a 95 octane in the United States fuel, and they've got another basic fuel. They have a 12% ethanol mandate, 10% biodiesel mandate. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics down there that, provide a lot of similarities in terms of challenges that we're encountering here in the United States.
Let's take apart the various trends that are going on there. Now, you mentioned the full serve, and New Jersey and Oregon are the 2 holdouts right now, and those laws have been on the books for going on 70 years. And you hear, at least in New Jersey, that the challenge is, how do you get somebody inside the store when they don't have to get out of their car? How do they remedy that in places like Buenos Aires?
So the stores I went to, obviously when people are showcasing your stores, they're showing you the newest, the greatest, but the designs are very different. You go inside the store, there's not the traditional convenience store market. You may have a couple of cabinetries and a couple of doors of soda and drinks and stuff, but it's not your traditional convenience store that you see in the United States. They really focus on the food service element. The coffee service, the cafe, is a huge draw. They've got great food service, made to order and ready to grab. They have a lot of tables and chairs. They have free Wi-Fi in a lot of these stores. They have TVs. They've got plugs for all your apparatus. It really is designed to encourage people to hang out for a while. So you have a lot of foot traffic come by, a lot of parking. And every store we went to, we were double parking to go take a look because there was no spaces available. They were also lined up 2 and 3 cars deep at each fueling position. I mean, these were some high volume stores, but they didn't seem to be reliant too much on moving people from the car inside the store.
Are the gas tanks smaller there? Are we talking about 8-gallon, 10-gallon capacity as opposed to like the 18-gallon minivans here?
The cars are very different. I mean, I always get a kick going overseas because you see a completely different fleet mix. The cars are much more European based, so they're much smaller. You don't see a whole lot of big pickups. You see variants of vehicles you don't see here in the United States. There's 2 trucks down there, the Volkswagen Aeromock and the Toyota Helix. I would love to have here. They are cool looking trucks. You don't see them here. So I assume, not knowing for certain, I assume the fuel tanks are probably a little bit smaller. They're almost all flex fuel because in Argentina, most of their cars are also destined for the Brazilian market. So they're designed to run on a high ethanol. So you don't have a concern like you have in the United States of vehicles running on ethanol blends higher than 10% because they're all designed to run on more than that. But it is a very different market down there.
And so it sounds like there's you get get what you want and get out of there really fast. If you just want fuel, it's the ultimate because it's full serve, go.
Right. And,
if you need that.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is the focus on the lubricants market, the oil market, is much larger down there than I've ever seen here. My guess is a couple things. One, the cars down there are usually older. And so they take care of the cars. They want them to last a little longer. Here in the United States, 3 years you get in the car, getting rid of it. Down there, they're holding the cars a little bit longer, so taking care of it's important. The full serve attributes, right next to the dispenser is a whole cabinet of oils. And so the full serve attendant offers to clean your windshield, check your oil, check your lubes, and there is an opportunity there to sell more. Another big difference down there that I think is critical, and going back to your opening comment about the size of the industry internationally, they are really concentrated. The top 2 or 3 retail chains dominate the market, 70% or more market share between the 3 of them. In the United States, there's nobody that has, I don't think, double-digit market share in terms of volume or store count. Down there, you talk to 2 or 3 companies, you've talked to almost the entire market, and it is a very different way of competing down there.
So it really is a little bit also talking about at the pump. It's a little bit more focus on what we used to have in the U.S. called TBA, where it was tires, batteries, accessories. That was the model that you get the full serve. Mm-hmm. And is there a way to make some money on some of those things? Now, it's not NASCAR. So I assume they're not changing your tires there at the pump. No. But there is a little bit of an upsell that helps pay for some of those higher labor costs, right?
A little bit. But, I mean, they did comment quite a bit about having to cover labor costs. And one of the reasons I have full serve is for jobs. It was a jobs initiative for the most part. I think some people in the United States may advocate full service for environmental concerns. The benefit of full service compared to what we have in self-service is when you're changing fuel mix, it's pretty easy to control misfueling because you're not asking the customer to make a decision as to which fuel to buy. So you think about the high-octane fuel down there, which we're talking about high-octane fuels in the United States, and everybody talks about it being a mid-level ethanol blend of 20 to 30, maybe 40% ethanol. Down there, they have a 12% ethanol, and they're boosting their octane using alkylates. Now, there may be some emissions controls in the United States that don't exist down there that might make it more challenging here. But even if they were to go to a higher blend, you're controlling who can fuel. Natural gas is a big deal down there in Argentina. I think that's somewhere around 15% of vehicles are natural gas, a lot of the fleets and for hire. But I looked at the natural gas dispensers. There's not a single self-service customer in the United States that would use one of these things. You actually open up the hood and you thread it onto the natural gas reservoir in the engine compartment. It's not it's not a gun. It's not a trigger like we have for ours. And I commented on that, and they said, well, it's all full serve. So the attendants are trained. It's not like you're trying to teach the customer to do anything new. So that's an advantage when you're trying to introduce a new product down there. You don't have to teach the customer too much like you do in the United States.
Yeah, and I'd probably be more like Chevy Chase in Vacation, where I'd be looking for the right thing to find the nozzle, and I'd just rip off the license plate, and then everybody'd stare at me, and then they'd make me leave.
Yeah, and it is a different market, but similarities exist. And so in the United States, we are dealing with a situation with our diesel tanks. After removing sulfur from our product, we've been encountering some excessive corrosion and what seems to be microbial contamination in our tanks, which can render a new equipment to look like it's 10 years old in about 6 months. And you get coffee ground-like deposits in your tanks. It's become a major problem. The EPA came out with some recommended practices about a month or so ago, summer of 2016, to help people manage their tanks. They're having the same problem down in Brazil and Argentina because they have a 10 parts per million sulfur down there. And they've done a lot of research in terms of how to manage your tanks, which we're going to bring back to the United States, give to the Environmental Protection Agency and the retailers so that we can share that knowledge across the spectrum, because they've been at a lower sulfur level for longer than we have. They had the same experience, but they've started to figure out how to deal with it. And so I think it's important to learn that you have situations overseas that may be replicated here. when I mentioned this to EPA, they were unaware of the similarities in those markets. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to really bring the best practices across borders.
Well, the ultra-low sulfur diesel took it from, 500 parts per million to 15, and that was right around, 2003, 2004, 2005, that
2006. Yeah, it was at 2006. We phased it in between 2006 and 2010. Now we're across the board at 15 parts per million. The reason we did that is because we needed more efficient, cleaner burning diesel engines. And the particulate traps and NOx absorbers, the environmental controls on them are very sensitive to sulfur. So you had to pull that sulfur out. But sulfur seemed to have a property that kills the bacteria. So if we had bacterial growth, guess what? Sulfur killed it. Sulfur also, there's quite a bit of water in diesel fuel. And people don't understand that there's quite a bit of water. And so the sulfur actually keeps the water in suspension. And so you didn't have the separation of water from the diesel, and it went into the engine, and it burned. But the older diesel engines weren't sensitive to water. But now that water's separating out, it's creating an environment for the bacteria to grow in a much more hospitable situation. So we're seeing accelerated bacteria growth. At least that's what we're hearing from some experts in the United States and down in the South American markets. But learning what they've done and how they're controlling it, because they are much more diesel-centric than we are in the United States, something in the neighborhood of majority of their vehicles are diesel. I think it's like 50% of their vehicles are diesel compared to gasoline, which, you got to look at those markets to learn. If we're transitioning to more of a diesel or a different spec, we need to understand that.
And so you mentioned water. The fuels also are a little bit more water-based here, which is, I think, if I understand correctly, where in the U.S. you think about gasoline, ethanol, water, they don't work well together.
Yeah, so Brazil is always pointed to as the example of what we can do right with ethanol and how we can increase ethanol use. But their ethanol market's different. They use a hydrous ethanol, which the base ethanol is 93% ethanol, 7% water, and that's blended into the fuel. In the United States and every other market that I'm aware of, it is a water-free. And so when you are blending the fuel with water in it, you don't have phase separation where the ethanol is going to leave the gasoline looking for water, because water's sitting right there with it. They brought their date to the prom. Now, in the United States, we throw ethanol into gasoline without their prom date, and the ethanol starts looking for water going, hey, I like water. And so sometimes if you're not managing your tank properly, and if you have any water contamination in your storage tank, sometimes that ethanol will actually leave the gasoline to phase separate. You don't have a full finished product. So it's a very different product. It seems to be working for them. Almost every vehicle down in Brazil and Argentina is flex fuel, so they can run anything from 0% ethanol up to 85% ethanol, or even higher than that. The United States, flex fuel is only about 8% of the market. So it's a very different situation. But it is interesting. You started seeing, Brazil is the example. Well, Brazil is a little different environment. So there's different management practices that are employed in Brazil that would need to be employed in the United States to accommodate the same type of blend ratio. The base gasoline in Brazil is a 25 to 27% ethanol mix. Every vehicle, every motorcycle, every small engine, every lawnmower runs on about a 25 to 27% ethanol blend. And, United States, we don't allow that to happen. So E15 was approved only for 2001 newer engines, not approved for Marines, lawnmowers, and motorcycles. And I asked somebody from Brazil about 5 years ago, I said, I don't understand it. I'm down here in Sao Paulo and Rio. I'm seeing motorcycles all over the place. You guys have lawnmowers. You have weed whackers. You have chainsaws. You're all using E25. How is that possible? His response said, John, in Brazil, when we have a problem with our engine, we call a mechanic. In the United States, you call a lawyer. And that really is fundamental truth here, that our tort system in the United States makes it so much more complicated to transition our market and introduce new products, even on a trial basis, because we're so concerned with litigation at every step of the way. I think there's a lot we can learn from a more laissez-faire attitude overseas.
Now, you had mentioned earlier it's really instructive for us to learn from South America in terms of the ultra-low sulfur diesel, and they're even lower than us. They've been around longer. What about some of the issues related to ethanol and those higher ethanol components in terms of how it affects all the other elements in fueling, whether it's the dispenser, vehicles, et cetera? Have there been any learnings from there?
They've been transitioning for a while. And so they started bringing the higher compatibility rated equipment earlier. And they've not had significant problems. And I talked to 5 or 6 retailers out down there, and nobody reported any problems because of ethanol. So you know what? It's a supply issue for them in Argentina, because they just increased from 10 to 12% this year. And We talked about in one segment we talked about infrastructure. We talked about pipelines, and there are very few pipelines running through Argentina. It is a big country. It's about the size of the United States, if not bigger. And a lot of their production comes from the northern side of the country, but most of the population's further south. Yet their rails are antiquated, their pipelines are limited and directionally based. Most of the products are being shipped by truck. Now think about that. A country the size of the United States, where you're transferring product from one side of the country to the other by truck, not the most efficient system in the world.
Little mountainous too.
There's a few mountains in Argentina, yeah. And so you think about, when Colonial Pipeline had a supply problem in the summer of 2016, we had immediate supply shortages and price problems and market challenges because we couldn't supply the market. Well, we have a pretty advanced and complex pipeline system. It was a lot of product. If we didn't have the pipeline system, those supply challenges would be regularly occurring because we'd have to be relying upon alternative methods of transportation, which are not always as efficient as pipelines. So we can learn about the Argentinian model and what they're dealing with, and we compare it to what we're dealing with, and we complain when we have a problem, but it recovers pretty quickly, and most of the time we take it for granted. They can't take it for granted down there because they have different challenges that we have.
So I guess to a certain extent, ironically, here in the U.S., you generally don't put ethanol in the pipelines because of the issues you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Yet there, where could they put ethanol in the pipelines if they wanted to, but their pipeline infrastructure isn't as robust as ours?
I don't know what the regulations are. But the pipeline infrastructure doesn't have capacity to handle it. There is, in doing an infrastructure paper for the Fuels Institute, I did learn that a couple of the pipelines have specifications to tolerate 10% ethanol in the pipeline. But for business reasons and other issues, they're not shipping it. But the U.S. distribution system for biofuels is so advanced and has become so efficient as we've increased our use of ethanol and biodiesel in the country, even the limitations or the lack of desire to move the product through pipeline has not limited the availability regionally. So I remember when we first started selling ethanol in the United States on a broad basis, it was almost all regionally produced in the Midwest. And there were concerns. I was working for an Iowa congressman at the time. How are we going to get product from Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota to California and Florida? Well, at the time, those are some issues. Those aren't problems anymore. We have gotten so efficient on rail distribution, truck distribution, barge distribution, more diverse production of ethanol facilities in the country that getting the product where it needs to be is not an issue. The challenge that we have here is how do we accommodate fleet configurations to accommodate more ethanol? How do we adjust our regulations or our TORP program to allow us to move into different biofuel blends and different fuel blends in general without that fear of constantly being sued if you sneeze in the wrong direction? I think it's important that we figure out a way to let the market dictate which direction we go rather than having the courts or the fear of going to court. And there's lessons to learn overseas. Not that we want to mimic government regulations and policies overseas all the time, but we need to understand how they've approached it and see if there's a way we can actually learn from them and implement some of those policies and procedures to make our system more efficient, more effective, and more open to innovation. I think that's what I really kind of walked away from is there's some antiquated systems in the markets I was visiting, but there are some innovation that we are really holding back on the United States. I think we can learn from them.
Yeah, one other thing just worth asking is here in the U.S., ethanol is largely affiliated with corn. Mm-hmm. And I have heard in South America and other markets, it may be switchgrass, it may be sugarcane, it may be some other biomass.
Mm-hmm. It's sugarcane.
Is that a potential future for us? Could we even grow? Is it more efficient per stock or per whatever way you clarify biomass? Well, and is it a future, or does sugar not grow in the U.S.?
So we do grow some sugar in the United States, but nothing like they grow in South America. If you take a look at the California regulations on carbon fuels, they actually believe that sugarcane produced ethanol from Brazil has a lower carbon intensity than corn being shipped from Brazil all the way to California than corn-based ethanol shipped from Iowa and Illinois. So they believe that their analysis on greenhouse gas impact is that sugarcane is less energy intensive to produce. That's one thing. When you start talking about switchgrass and other biomass, That is getting into an advanced biofuels market, which is very small scale right now. There's programs in place to encourage it. It takes quite a bit of effort. And the challenge with the cellulosic or advanced biofuels market is we need to reduce the cost of production. And really, you're not seeing a whole lot of it in any market at this point. We need to get that cost of production down to where it makes economic sense to bring it to market. Once that happens, then you've got a much lower greenhouse gas profile. You've got a huge amount of volume, and then we have opportunities. It's important to know that it doesn't matter what your feedstock is. The final product, ethanol, has the exact same handling issues and legal issues that corn-based ethanol does. So it helps supply, it helps greenhouse gases, helps the environment. It may not necessarily help infrastructure unless we start making some changes to our programs.
Well, if there's one thing I learned today, I'm going to phrase it differently. Water and gasoline are basically like the +1 at a dance or at a wedding or prom or something like that. The other thing is that we'll bring ideas from around the world, and you don't have to go anywhere. You can ride in your car, and you can see stories from around the world. So I think it's really interesting and really instructive on where we might be going as a country, as a fueling infrastructure. It's important to go around the world and see what's going on.
And you know what? This podcast is reaching a lot. I want to give a shout out to my friends down in Argentina and Brazil for hosting me when I was down there visiting. Thank you guys for listening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
And thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
You've been listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. For more information about the National Association of Convenience Stores, go to nacsonline.com.